the 19th century took on its own shape toward the end of the millennium, trailing behind 9 centuries worth of warfare and diseases, the desire to stay healthy was a natural precursor. The century didn't mean people hadn't explored ideas about healing the human body, because trying to understand the body is as old as civilization itself. What made the 19th century appear more sophisticated, even though it wasn't quite there yet, was due to the acceptance of secular ideas and growth of publications available to a literate public. While the power of print changed humanity, including religion with fierce proficiency of Martin Luther, and politics in both Europe and America with the Enlightenment movement and the American Revolution, however, a glaring question comes to mind. Why in the world did it take longer to change people's perspective on their own health? Quite simply, it was more about the attitude rather than education. Respectable people of the Christian faith didn't want their bodies desecrated. The belief was this: if you stole a pig, you were hung. If you killed a man, you were hung, then dissected like a pig. The Western attitude began to alter with an 1832 English law that permitted doctors and surgeons to legally acquire corpses, so graves were to be left alone. 2.5 decades later, the germ theory, originating with the Renaissance era, finally revealed proof with the help of chemists and their microscopes. However, it wasn't until the 1890s when both bacteria and viruses were fully understood. Until then, through the 19th century, the public relied on experimentations from both doctors and their so-called experts for answers. And the printing business took advantage of it. As a result, it opened up doors for medicine to become a business itself. Therefore, in the spirit of entrepreneurship, several busters jumped in at the height of the latest health crazes. For them, it was about sulfur springs and tonics. Hydropathy, a method to treat ailments with cold water, was rediscovered by an illiterate Austrian farmer, Vincent Presnitz, in the 1820s. Meanwhile, decades before Vincent Presnitz implemented hydropathy, in America, warm and hot springs were already in operation. People with ailments were recommended by doctors to visit these warm and hot springs to improve their health. Resting on the west side of the Blue Ridge Mountains of Greenbrier County, not too far off in the distance where the first generation of the Busters and Woods originally settled, just west of Shenandoah Valley, the General Assembly of Virginia chartered the foundation of Blue Sulphur Springs. The springs in the western part of Virginia's mountains inherited a couple of advantages. 1. The isolation prevented cholera outbreaks. 2. The cooler climate deterred mosquitoes from nesting in hordes and thus contained the spreading of yellow fever. The distance between Charleston and the Sulphur Springs were around 120 miles apart. That alone had to attract people fleeing from these deadly diseases. Inspired by the shimmering rainbow-like sulfur colors mixing in the water, this particular spring was submerged in a wide valley between Kitchen Creek and Sawmill Valleys, surrounded by densely forested mountains and mist, and 5 other springs. Already harboring a reputation with its sulfuric potions, the investment seemed solid. It was considered a warm spring rather than a hot one because the natural temperature usually maintained an average Fahrenheit of 53 degrees. The resort served 2 valuable purposes. It was constructed not only for treatment, but mostly for lavish luxury and entertainment. A white 3-story hotel was attached to a pair of 2-story lodging buildings, which could serve 200 guests on any given day. A Greek Revival pavilion, also referred to as the Temple, revealed a square hole in the middle as a way for guests to gaze upon the mystical bluish water. Walking trails guided by paths of trees, a flowing creek, and a bathhouse with healing gifts drew in people from all over. 20 cottages were distinctively built for wealthy families. The resort's haven also included a ballroom, drawing rooms for pleasure and counting rooms for businesses, as well as numerous chambers for smaller groups. in addition to lodging or horse stables and servant quarters for full accommodations. During the 1840s, at its zenith, prestigious men from all over visited, including former Presidents Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, statesman and presidential candidate Henry Clay, lieutenant of engineers and graduate of West Point Robert E. Lee, before becoming a general, and a former European prince, Jerome Bonaparte, youngest brother of Napoleon I. It was the place to be and was famously known for taking the waters for either health reasons or for indulgence. George W. Buster would be the major player behind Blue Sulphur Springs, affectionately referred to as the Blue. George Washington Buster was the oldest son of Claudius Jr. and grandson of Major Claudius, the one who once owned the Ivory Tavern. Although born in Albemarle County in 1801, George moved to Greenbrier County, the outer western part of Virginia, sometime in the mid to late 1820s, where he met his first wife, Elizabeth Reynolds. Tragedy soon invaded his life. Just 3 years into his marriage, Elizabeth succumbed to the consequences of childbirth. She may have died during child labor or just shortly after giving birth to their second daughter, who also did not survive. Another 3 years would come to pass before George married his second wife, Anne Chilton, who descended from a historically prominent family of the Chiltons and Blackwells. Her English roots and noble lineage can be traced back to the Mayflower and their Crusades. With certainty, George did not ignore her connections as one of his motives in marrying Anne, even if the motives were guided by genuine sentiments. All in all, his social and political life didn't sit in idleness, and the next 20 years would be considered his golden years before his world collided with struggling economics and an unstoppable war. One of the first disappointments arrived in Dr. Burke's second edition, printed in 1846. In his original publication, he wrote a favorable review with an adequate 3.5-page tribute.
The buildings are extensive and in good taste. The table said to be among the best in the west side of the Blue Ridge.
Then a problem will foreshadow what will come next.
We are indebted to a friend for the following account of the improvements at this interesting watering place.
The good doctor had yet to visit Blue Sulphur Spring. 4 years later, he sung a very different tune. To start, he contradicted his friend's interpretation, who thought 300 people could be accommodated, but according to Dr. Burke himself, he lowered the number to 220. Then he retracted what he stated previously.
We said that this valley is beautiful. We should perhaps have said it has been. Fate illume.
Fate illume translates to Troy has been or is no more, mocking the resort's Greek revival theme against the historic disaster and its humiliation, a consequence he pointed out. Regardless that Dr. Burke admitted enjoying some of the services and amenities, his dislike of the construction and architecture took on a cheap attack against the resort that George personally coordinated. More specifically, it was an attack on the French physician, Dr. Alexis Martin, who George had hired. Dr. Burke went on to taunt Martin's abilities as a healer, first off by never referring to Martin as a doctor.
We found Martin a polite old gentleman, but we wished he had been a bird of passage, and could have carried off his nest in a bill, never again to mar this valley. We were angry enough to throw him into his own boiler, or worse, to consign him to the care of Dr. Mormon,
of White Springs Sulphur and Dr. Burke's competitor,
who might cause him to evolve gas in the stomach for such an act of barbaric taste.
Dr. Burke also referred Dr. Martin as a French comedian whose
arrangements of the bathhouse are quite extensive and well contrived. They would equally be deleterious in the hands of the empire or selfish, disingenuous man.
Despite complimenting George by stating he had made favorable impression and that Dr. Burke's subjective injuries were satisfied, the doctor then concluded with,
"We trust that he, Mr. Buster, will reap the just reward of his intention annually increasing company."
Although sounding like a positive endorsement with emphasis on just reward, however, his tone implied that in spite of the resort's flaws, Dr. Burke might not have had enough trust in George's charm to bring people to the resort in spite of itself. No question, George would have been offended on many accounts. Not only was his vision mocked, but so was the man whom he admired, to which he named one of his sons after. Dr. Alexis Martin permanently relocated to Blue Springs Sulphurs in 1840 on 1 acre of land, but the friendship between Dr. Martin and George went further. George's son, Alexis M. Buster, was born 4 years prior to Dr. Martin's arrival, indicating the men had a strong friendship for quite some time. Any personal letters that may have exchanged did not survive, so finding exactly when their friendship began is unknown. One reason there may not have been any letters was due to the fact that Dr. Martin spoke broken English and was illiterate, to the point of barely being able to write his name. In spite of this, he flaunted an alluring personality accompanied by a curious life. Born in France right around 1791, he had been a surgeon for Napoleon's imperial army before the end of the war, as mentioned in his obituary. The grandiosity of the Blue garnished quite the reputation by the time 1840 made an entrance. Unfortunately, George's vision would start to deteriorate. Despite Dr. Burke's unfavorable review, like the diplomatic southerner that George was, he didn't publicly attack Dr. Burke in turn. His reputation needed to precede him in order to keep his resort operating, especially since there was competition, 5 other springs to be exact. Then George's patrons weren't paying their bills. Their promissory notes were adding up without supporting their promises to actually honor their debt. Nearly 2 decades later, since opening to the public, his partners wanted out. He was left to purchase the rest of the company by August of 1852 for $12,600, being the amount of $380,000 by today's standards, thereby becoming the sole owner until 1859. Things did not get better. Misfortune advanced even after the transfer when he sold his business to the Baptist University. A fire, either in the kitchen or the laundry room, burnt the main building in 1860. A year later, war finally ruptured the Union, losing most of the students to fight on both sides. The school closed their doors in 1861. After the war, and by default, George was granted the return of his property. The courts deemed the deposits from Baptist Association invalid since the remainder of the currency were in Confederate bills. Therefore, the next series of transactions during the war were considered null and void. As a result of it all, George's wealth was reduced to owing $2 in property taxes by 1866. The following year, he died. Dr. Martin did stay in Greenbrier County, where he lived an additional 12 years succeeding his friend's death. The Pavilion of Blue Sulphur Springs remarkably exists today, although it is in great decay. The property remained under the Busters until 1962, when George's grandson, Bernard, sold it to a local resident, Louis Fleshman. By 1992, it was registered on the National Register of Historic Places, to where Fleshman's daughter, Rebecca, who inherited it, but then later donated it to the Greenbrier Historical Society for preservation. To this day, the Friends of the Blue intend to restore the pavilion to its glorious capacity. So far, the vision has been guided more from faith than rather having the finances to produce the dream.